Hello, all you happy innovators. How you doing? Are you having a good week? I hope you're having a good week. Here we are at episode 33 of SnowFlake 33. The end of SnowFlake 33. It's a little bit sad, but the end is the beginning is the end, you know. So don't feel too bad. This whole thing's going to continue, but just in a different form, slightly different form anyway. Of course, you know, I do reserve the right to occasionally change things or change direction at will, you know, because after all, this is my show. And I would imagine that as my audience, you probably appreciate the spirit of that. My creative process and my ideas are, you know, kind of a wild card kind of thing. And I would like to think that if you're tuning in to me, whether it's the music or the talking or whatever it is, that you probably appreciate that, at least on some level. Anyway, so we are here at this final episode of SnowFlake 33, the 33rd episode of SnowFlake 33, and I had reserved a very special topic for this particular episode. You know, originally I wanted to talk about this in the first couple of episodes, but, you know, one thing led to another and that wound up not happening. And I'm kind of glad for that now, because now I get to wrap up this whole SnowFlake 33 thing, discussing the topic that's probably, you know, one of the most important to me anyway. As far as my career as an outsider artist, as far as my development when I was younger and even into my adult life. And I guess, you know, I'll just cut to the chase, you know. There have been a lot of people in my life that have had a lot of impact. I've had, you know, a lot of influences, a lot of heroes, a lot of remarkable people that I knew personally. I've known a lot of great men. I've known a lot of great women. But when I look back on my life in its totality, okay, and I think of all the people that I've known, and there's a lot, okay, but there's one person that really kind of stands out to me in my memory, and that person is my grandfather, okay? My grandfather on my mother's side, okay? My grandfather is kind of like a legend in my family, okay? He's kind of like this Paul Bunyan kind of character, you know, where different family members and, you know, from all different ages have different memories of him. And he was this like remarkable individual. He was extremely creative. He was extremely compassionate. He was physically strong. He was really funny. And my grandfather was a very unique individual. He was different than everyone else. And I guess that's what I want to talk about with this final episode of SnowFlake 33. I can't think of a better person to dedicate it to, or a better memory to dedicate it to, than that of my grandfather on my mother's side. Okay, there's a big difference in my family between my dad's dad and my mom's dad. Two very different people. Okay. I did not know my grandfather on my father's side as well as I knew my grandfather on my mother's side, because my grandfather on my father's side died when I was really young. Okay, I have a very vague memory of him, but my grandfather on my mother's side was a pretty big part of my life. I spent quite a bit of time with my grandparents. My family spent quite a bit of time with my grandparents at their house and vice versa. And so I think that my grandfather is, a pretty good topic to end SnowFlake 33 with, and kind of just like segue into the next phase of my podcasting and what I'm going to be talking about in the future. I just can't think of a better topic to end this project with. And I also think it's kind of funny. I want to mention this really quick, in case you haven't noticed already, that as I'm talking to you, I'm sick. Yeah, that's right. I have like a cold right now. I kind of had to laugh to myself because it's like a year to the day almost that I started SnowFlake 33, and like I mentioned a couple episodes back, I was sick and I decided to do it anyway. Well, of course, as soon as I started planning on doing this final episode, bam, I got sick, man. And it like sucks, but it's like I said, I have to laugh. Just go right ahead and keep going. Just do it anyway. Do the last episode sick. It's like tradition now, right? Pretty funny. It's definitely not something I planned, but you can hear it in my voice, right? At least I'm not like talking like I'm absolutely dying, It's more like just in my nose or whatever. So I apologize for that, but I did have to laugh because it's like, oh yeah, okay, it's tradition. I get it. Why not? Just go right ahead and keep talking anyway. Anyway, back to my grandfather, this guy, that had this huge impact on me for so many reasons and in so many ways. So I figured like there's so much to talk about with my grandfather. I mean, it crosses over, and it's the themes and the impact my grandfather had on me is so broad that you can break it up into categories, like my existence as an artist, my existence as a man, my existence as a child, my existence as a songwriter, my existence as a husband. The categories that my grandfather impacted in my life are so broad. I mean, I could talk about him for days. I mean, there's so much to talk about. So I'm going to really try to fit it all in. I suppose what I'll do is I'll talk to you about my grandfather in my memories, like what comes to me first, okay? And when I think about my grandfather, the very first thing that I think about is how strong he was. That's like the first memory I have, okay? My grandfather, when I was like a little kid, he was like in his 70s or 80s, okay? So he was an older man, well past retirement, but he was still physically strong, okay? Now, when I say that, what I mean is my grandfather was ripped, okay? He was huge. He was like, his arms were huge, his chest. I mean, he was one of the strongest people I ever knew, okay? When I was a kid, I have a memory of my grandfather tearing phone books in half, okay? Like, we would be over at their house and we would be like, oh, Grandpa, can you tear a phone book in half for us, And he'd be like, all right. And he'd just, reach over and grab it, just tear it right in half, like rip. And, I don't know where he was getting all these phone books from, but he never seemed to mind tearing his phone book in half for us. It was something he would do for, like, entertainment for us. It was great. Amazing, actually. Okay? So he was this huge, strong, physically strong, and robust elderly man. Okay? And, I remember that, most of the time my grandfather, would dress, really conservatively, kind of like, a button-up shirt and a pair of slacks, nice shoes or something like that. Like the proper decorum, for an elderly man, But every once in a while, when we would go over to their house, like he would be working out in the yard and he would have like his shirt off, and he would be working and sweaty and just, doing something. And I remember he was very strong and very tan. And my grandfather is like 70 years old, okay? White chest hair, okay? But built like a brick shit house, And he wasn't a fire plug either. He was tall and he was just physically strong, okay? And I remember too how big his hands were and how weird his hands were, really, because they were like leather. I mean, his hands were working man's hands. My grandfather, before he retired, had worked for a company called Ohio Bell, which was a telephone company. And Ohio Bell is actually where my grandparents met. My grandmother worked at the phone company as an operator, and my grandfather was a lineman. He would climb telephone poles manually and fix telephone lines. That's what he did for a living. And my grandfather did that job for like 40 years. And for the most part, it was the only job that he ever had. And eventually, after they got married, my grandmother stopped working. But he had the same job for like 40 years. But, I explained to you a few episodes back about how I had done land clearing, construction, clearing out trees for new buildings that were going up. Okay, I did that for quite some time. Now, when I did that job, I was a ground guy. I was on the ground, dropping trees and clearing out areas for new buildings to be built. I didn't climb the trees. I just cut them down from, the ground. And my buddy that was in Slow Bob didn't climb either. Okay? So, like, one of the things I learned on that job, working with that guy from Slow Bob and that construction crew, was that being a climber is a different kind of thing, okay? It requires different strength and a different kind of physical endurance, okay? And we would hire out somebody to come and climb for us when that needed to be done. Okay, it was a special thing we would hire someone for. When a tree was too close to a building or something, we would hire a climber. Well, by doing that job and watching and observing these climbers, I kind of had a different appreciation for what my grandfather did for a living. Okay? I understood, I think maybe a little bit better, what that required. Like what kind of strength he would have to summon to do that job every day. Okay? And the kind of physical strength you need. The kind of physical strength that's required to do that kind of work. So it makes sense to me now when I think about my grandfather and how physically strong he was, why he was that strong. And like I said, his hands were, of course I was a little guy, right? So his hands seemed absolutely huge to me, but I remember what they looked like. Okay, and they were like leather. I mean, my grandfather's hands were so calloused and so worked and worn that the skin on his fingers was different than everyone else's. Okay, very coarse and very strong and durable. And when I think about my grandfather, those are the first things that come to mind. That's the first things that come to my memory. Okay. The second thing that comes to my memory was the fact that my grandmother, my mother's mother, had rheumatoid arthritis. Okay, she was riddled with arthritis when I was a young kid. So my memory of my grandmother is this very small and frail woman, okay, who was for the most part immobile, suffering extreme amounts of pain on a daily basis, right? Because she had this arthritis and it was really bad. Okay, it was really bad. Her fingers were disfigured from this disease. Okay, that's why I remember this. And the contrast between my grandfather and my grandmother, these two completely different specimens of human being. Okay, one very frail and very weak and dependent on him, and then this other figure, my grandfather, who was robust and strong and loud and funny and full of life and energy and power. I mean, this guy was extremely animated and charismatic, and when he talked, people listened, and when he made a joke, people laughed. I mean, he was like that kind of guy. But he cared for my grandmother, and he loved my grandmother so much. Okay? Everybody that knew my grandmother loved her. Okay? My father has testified to that more than even my mother has. Okay? And I'll get to that story later on, because it's an important part of the story, the relationship between my father and my mother's mother, my grandmother. Now the next kind of thing that comes to my memory is how different visits were to my grandparents' house as opposed to where I lived. Okay, now we didn't live very far away from my grandparents. The drive was maybe a couple of cities over, a couple of towns over. Okay, but my grandfather was a very unique individual. Okay, his tastes and his worldview were very eccentric. Okay, and I suppose that ultimately, okay, when I talk about the impact that my grandfather had on me as a person, this is definitely one of those things that I took from him. That it's important for a man to be physically strong, okay? And be able to take care of business, like to be that kind of person. But at the same time, be compassionate and delicate with people. That those two things can exist at the same time. And that it's important that you be your own person and be unique. Like, being a unique person is admirable. It's something to strive for. That a person shouldn't readily fit into categories so easily. You know, that he could be strong and eccentric. Like, that he could be macho, for lack of a better term, or eccentric or creative at the same time. That those two things could be in the same person at the same time. And what made him special or unique or different from everyone else was what was coming from inside of him. Okay, that's what made my grandfather unique to me, among many things. And I'm going to try to touch on all of them. Now, I'll give you some examples of what I'm talking about. Well, for one thing, when we would go over to my grandparents' house, I remember it being like my grandfather relished, and that's the word I would use. Both of my grandparents relished their grandchildren. Okay? They reveled in it. They loved their grandchildren. They loved having grandchildren. Okay? Now, I know, having said that, okay, that it's not an unusual thing or a spectacular thing that, grandparents love their grandchildren. I do know and understand that that is the case most of the time. However, and you may know this, that it's not always a given, okay? And I consider myself fortunate that that's how it was for me, okay? Because after all, this is my story. So I do understand it's not unusual that grandparents love their grandchildren. But my grandparents loved me. Okay? So when we went over to their house, it was like we kind of had a supremacy. We got to rule the roost a little bit because we were, I guess you could say we were kind of spoiled by them. Now, when I was at home with my parents, it was not that way. It was the opposite, okay? We were not spoiled by my parents whatsoever. In fact, it was, kind of a austere or, mundane kind of existence, like my parents were very careful with their money. They had to be. And we had more than enough and we were comfortable and all those things. But when we went to my grandparents' house, it was different. Okay, when I went to my grandparents' house, this is what I remember. They had cookies. They had every kind of cookie that you could think of in their cupboard. And both of my grandparents, my grandfather and my grandmother, took a great deal of pride in that cookie stash that they had for us. Okay? It was something they devoted time and energy to. So when we showed up, it was like a feast. Like it was the opposite of what it was like when we were at home. And I just remember that kind of spirit in their house, that when the grandchildren showed up, we took center stage. They loved it, okay? And my parents would kind of just have to deal with it, okay? Like, it was our show, And it definitely wasn't like that at home. And that kind of love and that kind of generosity, that spirit of love that I got from both of my grandparents is something I remember very, very clearly. Okay? And it matters a great deal, especially now that so much time has passed. That's what stands out in my memory. My grandparents were happy. Their house was happy. And my house was happy. But it was just a little happier at Grandma and Grandpa's house. Do you know what I mean? Now, also, too, my grandfather's house was very small. Okay, it wasn't a very big house, but it was like a museum. That would be like the best way to describe it. It was literally like an art museum. Now, when I say that, what I mean is like not that my grandfather was hanging other people's artwork in his house. It was like his take on everything. How should I say it? Every single thing that was in my grandfather's house was very interesting. Everything in his house had either been built by him, modified by him, or was collected by him, and presented by him. So he had a lot of collections of things. He had a collection of paperweights, just all these different paperweights, and they were all on display. These different glass kind of paperweight things that he'd collected his whole life, or like the stuff he liked, the stuff that my grandfather displayed in his house or on his property was like, all of it was like an expression of him. And a lot of it was just fascinating. It was like every room of the house, every part of their property had something on it, or some kind of unique thing or picture or object, or just everywhere you looked. It was in the kitchen, it was in their front room, their bedroom, the attic, the basement, the front yard, the backyard, the barn, the garage, everything had his signature on it. Like his placement of items and his choice of items to put into his house was so unusual and unique. Like, I remember that he had a television, okay? It was a wooden, television console with the glass removed, the guts removed. It was completely empty, and it was made into a bookshelf. Okay? Now think about that. My grandfather turned his television into a bookshelf. Okay? Now, my grandfather was an artist, okay? He did paint, and he did sculpt, and he did woodworking. He had a workshop where he did woodworking, and he made furniture, but I don't think that he was intentionally being artistic. I don't think he even realized how artistic he actually was. Okay? And I don't think I realized it myself until I got older. Okay? Like, my grandfather was like the king of repurposing things. Okay? Like the television to a bookshelf, taking something that exists and then modifying it or changing it to become something else. Okay? Now, of all the things I learned from my grandfather, or that I took from my grandfather, that's probably the most important. Okay? Because that idea, that philosophy or that practice of repurposing things is something that I do myself. It's something that I do a lot of myself, and I would have to say that it's kind of like in honor of him. It's an attempt to continue that idea that he started. It's kind of like something that I feel I've inherited. It's part of my creative or artistic heritage that's been handed down to me by him. And it's something that I'm very proud of. It really was amazing. Some of the ideas that he had, like, for instance, here's an example. In his basement, he had this machete that he had made, okay? And it was a practical tool he needed for his property. I mean, he had a huge piece of property. The house wasn't big, but he had a lot of land, okay? And it was wooded, okay? Now, my grandfather's house had at one time been a working farm. Not so much when I was a kid. By that time, the farm thing had been kind of phased out a little, but the structures of a farm were still there. And it was a large piece of land with a lot of trees. So there was a practical need for something like a machete. Like, you would need it to do the work on the property. Well, rather than buying one, okay, what my grandfather did was he took an old lawnmower blade and he reshaped it, he cut it, he forged it and pounded it into a different shape, okay, and then he made this wooden handle for it, and he riveted it all together, and he had this nice, machete. And I remember being a little kid and going to his house and, like, you know, picking up this machete and like it was a sword or something, you know, a little bit of Napoleon Dynamite, you know, and it was like just the coolest thing, you know, as a little kid, like to have this thing in your hand, like, yeah, this is totally righteous, like a sword or something. Well, I have that machete. I took it. It was when my grandfather eventually moved out of his house and everything, and that'll come later in the story, but I wound up owning that machete, and maybe I'll show you a picture of it right here so you can see what I'm talking about. Another thing, like, here's another example of him repurposing something. He took a bunch of branches from trees, like on his property, and somehow had constructed this coat rack out of it. Okay, it's hard to explain, but it was a freestanding, like, hat and coat rack that was in his house. Okay, and it was like he took the refuse from his yard and cleaned it up a little bit and transformed it into this practical structure that he would use in his house. That's where he kept his coats and his hats. They were all on this rack that he had made. Another thing that comes to mind was, in his garage where his workshop was. It was the coolest thing. He had every license plate that he'd ever owned. Okay? Now, my grandfather was born in like 1901. Okay? And by 1978 or 1980, you know, he had accumulated so many different license plates over the course of his life, and he had them all on display on this wall in his workshop, and it covered the whole wall. Okay? Now, he had license plates on his wall from when he had a Model T Ford. Okay? Like, from when cars were first invented. Okay? He had his first license plate all the way up to his, you know, current ones, you know? And just as a little kid, you would stand staring at this wall, and it was like, you know, I guess like a form of like modern art. I mean, it was captivating because it covered so much time. But there again, it's an example of taking something and, you know, repurposing it, taking it off your car and putting it on the wall. Now it's something you look at like a piece of art. And just as a kid, it was like just fascinating to stand there and look at it, you know? What else? I mean, there's just so much about this guy, you know? Okay, here's a cool story. Here's something that's really crazy. My grandfather was digging around on his property once. I think he was like, you know, excavating a garden or something, you know, something like that. And he accidentally he dug up a Civil War rifle on his property. Okay? And he had this weapon, this old gun, refurbished professionally. You know, he had it cleaned up and made presentable, and he had it appraised as well for like $150,000 or some kind of crazy number like that. And it was on his wall in his house. So as a little kid, you know, I remember looking at this gun that was a relic of the Civil War, almost perfectly intact, on his wall. And, you know, we were allowed to touch it and like look at it. It was amazing. I mean, that in and of itself is something to stand there and stare at, right? Another interesting thing about my grandfather, okay, is that he always wanted to be a musician. Okay, I kind of got that from my grandfather, that he wanted to be a musician, but he failed at that. Okay, it was something that he could not do. And there was evidence of him trying, like a guitar and a ukulele up in his upstairs of his house, where we would spend most of our time when we were at their house. And I also remember that in his upstairs room, where we were allowed to kind of like hang out and play, he had this easel set up, right? And on it was like this piece of fabric that was covered with all of these different election pins, like the pins that politicians hand out when they're, campaigning, So he had, just this piece of fabric covered with all of these. Well, I mean, now I know for sure they were collectible and probably worth a lot of money. These campaign buttons from even like before World War I. Okay, and like all the way up to like, Ronald Reagan. So, Spiro Agnew, Richard Nixon, John F. Kennedy, Gerald Ford. I mean, all these campaign buttons, and it was like right at eye level for a little kid. So we would like look at this thing. It was like a piece of artwork in and of itself, just to look at this whole collection of buttons on this piece of fabric, set up on this easel. But he also had, in this same space, this guitar and this ukulele, which we were allowed to freely pick up and play and all these kinds of things, right? And we would. But what's really weird about this guitar that he had was that on the fretboard of the guitar, okay, where the frets are, where your fingers go to hold chords, right? He had all the notes written on the fretboard of this guitar. So, it was kind of like a guide for him to learn how to play this guitar. But despite that, he never really learned how to play. All right. Now, that's a very important thing for two reasons. One, it was probably my first exposure to a guitar, okay, where I was able to pick it up and play it whenever I wanted to, and no one would yell at me or stop me or anything. And this is a really important thing, especially now when I look back, because I was going to become a guitar player. I didn't know that at the time, but I was drawn to the instrument even when I was a kid, and I was allowed to experiment with that instrument even when I was just a little kid, okay? And we're talking like little, like 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, And another reason why that is important to my story is because even at that young age, okay, I was a drummer. I knew what I wanted to do. And that was rather unfortunate for me in some ways, because my parents didn't really know how to foster or nurture that kind of aptitude in a child. Okay? They didn't really have a grasp of that. I don't think that it was like an unwillingness necessarily. It was just a lack of knowledge about musical instruments and things like that. Okay? They liked music, they listened to music, but they didn't play music. Okay? But my grandfather did. Okay? He got it. And I think that, well, I know, okay, from this story that I'm about to tell you, that this is a really important thing, because there was this friend of mine who had a drum set, okay, that he was getting rid of. And I had a drum set that my parents had bought me, but it was kind of like a crappy drum set, okay? I mean, I was grateful for it. Don't get me wrong. They were real drums, but it was old and it was kind of junky and kind of an incomplete drum set. And my parents were kind of like not aware of that when they bought it. Like they wouldn't know what to buy me, okay? Even though I knew what to buy me. If they would have asked me, I could have told them, but they, I was a kid. And it was like a gift from Santa Claus, this drum set. So I was grateful for it, and I loved it, but it was incomplete. Well, anyway, this friend of mine, like I was saying, was selling his drum set, okay? He wanted to sell it for $50. $50. It was a trap set. It was a blue sparkle Apollo drum set. I remember it like, as clearly as I can remember anything in my life, because I just loved this drum set. But my mother and my father were kind of like refusing to buy it for me for $50 because I already had a drum set, and $50 is a lot of money when you're on a budget, right? Well, I was like heartbroken about this, okay? This was like a major disappointment for me, okay? Well, while this whole issue of this drum set was like up in the air and we were arguing about it and discussing it, I was probably about maybe 10 or 12 years old, okay? My grandfather was over at our house. For whatever reason, he was there, and my mother and I were going back and forth about this drum set, and my grandfather obviously overheard the conversation, and he's like, whoa. Like, wait, like, what are we talking about here? And my mother explains it to him. Well, he wants this drum set. It's $50, but he's already got a drum set, and we're not going to be spending that money. And, and my grandfather actually got angry with my mother, okay, which never happened, okay, because he loved my mother. She was spoiled, okay. She was his golden child, but he got angry with her because she just wasn't willing to lay the money down. It was about money. So my grandfather pulls out his wallet, slaps $50 down on the table right in front of me, and he says, "Go get your drums." Okay? And that was totally freaking righteous, right? But what it kind of showed me, or tells me now, as an adult looking back on it, was that he was digging the fact that one of his grandkids was going to be a musician. Okay? Like that one of his grandchildren had been bitten by the bug and had the gift that he did not have. My grandfather was a very, like I said, gifted and charismatic guy. But what really rocked his world was that one of his grandkids was going to be able to do something that he was never really able to do. And it was something he really desired. Okay? It was something he really tried to do, but he didn't succeed. So, honestly and truly, I have to say that, to this very day, every time I pick up an instrument, no matter what it is, guitar, bass, keyboards, drums, or even singing, whenever I'm engaging an instrument, I think about what it would mean to my grandfather if he were alive right now to see what I'm doing. Because of all the people in my life, okay, it probably would have mattered to him the most. And of all the grandchildren and all of the great-grandchildren that he had, and there were a lot, I was the only one who was a musician. I was the only one who was able to do what my grandfather was not able to do. And that is something that I'm very proud of. And I'm sure that if he were around right now, he would be proud too. He would have been absolutely tickled that I was doing what I'm doing. Okay? Even though some people in my family may not really understand why I'm doing what I do, how I do what I do, or whatever. Okay? He would have. He would have. And that is extremely important. Okay? And I guess, maybe that's where I'll leave off for right now. Okay? I'll amend because this story is so broad. Okay? This discussion is so broad. It can't be encapsulated in one episode of SnowFlake 33. So, like I said, I'll leave off here and I'll amend this episode in the next, which will be 33B. Okay? Anyway, so with that, this is Mike Bostwick signing off. And remember, folks, if you want to keep what you've got to give it away. Take it easy.